Good morning. It's really nice to be here and to be north of the river instead of south of the river, which is good. Yeah, so I'm Simon Walker. I'm head of the Educational Development Unit at the University of Greenwich, which was a relatively new unit that was set up about 3 years ago from, if you remember, TQEF money that was sort of used to sort of fund projects. And we were always, at Greenwich, we always never had this kind of central unit, unlike I think probably East London, for sort of driving through innovation. So this unit was set up, we had about 8 people or so. And we're now sort of moving forward on a whole variety of different things. So the unit works both in practice, so we have the academic practice PG Cert, which, have people done PG Cert here? Yeah, so, okay, not quite sure what the audiences want to assume here. But we have that in the unit, but we also work on policy and practice as well, and we have a number of research projects as well, which hopefully I'll talk to you about. In terms of experience with e-learning, I was a principal lecturer in the School of Education for about 15 years. And, good morning. And one of the things we did there was we started thinking about continuing professional development for teachers as sort of technology was starting to become much more ubiquitous and starting to kind of invade, if you like, the sort of classroom. And for 10 years we ran an online teacher training program called CELT, which I'll show you a little bit of. Which is actually since demised, but there's still a sort of website up about it. And that led into a whole range of different sort of research agendas and areas. More recently, we completed the first nationally funded MOOC, which with the Open University, which again I kind of make some reference to, but you've probably heard about MOOCs. It may be you know some good practice and bad practice around MOOCs. Maybe you've even done the MOOC that we put on. The other thing that we've been doing is running a national project around digital literacy. So we're just coming to the end of our 2-year project, and digital literacy I think is a really interesting aspect, particularly with the sort of current sort of news about PRISM and what the NSA are doing and what GCHQ are doing in terms of surveillance and the reputation, identity, all those sorts of things, and what that means for students and for teachers coming through around academic identity and reputation. So that's something which we've been very heavily involved in. And more recently, we're just starting to look at this, what's it called, Summer of Innovation, which is again a just funded project, which has shifted the sort of emphasis of sort of technology over into students. So JISC have now funded £5,000 for the institution to support student-funded innovation around technology. So again, I don't know if I didn't notice anything from East London when it went up there, but there were about 30 entrants that went up, and people had to crowdsource and vote on those things from across the institutions of higher education and abroad. So there's been some quite interesting sort of stuff going on in that whole agenda in terms of what we're doing as institutions, what our students are doing in terms of are they different to the way in which they used to be? Are they learning in different ways? What does that kind of mean? What are the implications for that? How do we then structure the kind of learning, the learning environments, all the way down through to the learning spaces that we learn in, and whether those things need to be changed, adapted, etc. So one of the this is the sort of look of the day that Brian and I have looked at. I don't know whether you're familiar, if you know what you're letting yourselves in for. Okay, fine, okay. So in a bit we'll do a little bit some introductions. I'll do a presentation, and then what I really want to do is to get some hands-on, because one of the things I think that we do is we often do things to our students without actually really being recipients of those things. So we talk about online learning, but actually we just seem to be designers of online learning, never at the kind of end of online learning. And the things that we do for students, they've been in that situation, are horrifying and horrific sometimes. So I wanted you to kind of experience what it might be like to be a student, and almost just sort of go along with me. So we're going to be looking at a piece of content which is just it could be any piece of content, but looking at some of the approaches that that we could take in terms of online learning, both within to support class learning and also distance learning as well. So looking at some of those sorts of aspects. Then got a break, and then we'll look at a plenary, and then we come back to some action planning. So what I'd really like to do is to have something which is very hands-on, but also something that results in something very, very practical, which is informed by a kind of more theoretical position or some theoretical positions. About a year ago, I was talking to our Vice-Chancellor, and he asked me what the big ideas around e-learning were. Obviously, he's very, very sort of familiar with what was going on in terms of the MOOCs. And he became even more kind of interested in it when I told him that the equivalent sort of Vice-Chancellor of the University of Virginia had been sacked because she hadn't taken her institution into a MOOC. All of a sudden he said, well, maybe you could find out a little bit more about these MOOCs. So that was kind of an interesting experience. But anyway, as a result of that, what we did was we put together a sort of research paper looking at all the influential papers which had been around e-learning for about the last five years or so, and produced a sort of 100-page document, which then enabled us to produce a strategy for innovation. But part of that process was going around all the different schools and saying, well, what is it you want for e-learning? What are the barriers for e-learning? And what are your particular kind of issues around e-learning? And of course, what we discovered was that every school had its own different way of doing things. I mean, Greenwich used to be Thames Polytechnic, so we've got this sort of massive sort of legacy of systems and processes and things as we've kind of migrated back down to Greenwich. So it may be very different here, but there's never been a sort of sense that there's a sort of a central view of things. But if you talk to School of Architecture, they're really into the Internet of Things. So you walk into a building and there's sensors on the building, it picks up the GPS on your phone, and it gives you sort of information back. Whereas School of Health said, well, we're not quite sure what we want. Just give us a model to work with and we'll kind of do it. And business were into kind of SharePoint and about sort of collaborative documentation and those sorts of things. So it struck me then that actually everybody wants something different, slightly different. So one of the things that we did, which again may be a sort of model here, is that you've all got your virtual learning environment. Well, that's a kind of a single common denominator. So you could start to think about how you develop that, and then start to add things onto that, which is the way in which we've approached it at least. Yeah, so going to the sort of presentational side of things then. So I'm supposed to be doing a sort of 30-minute or so presentation before we go downstairs and do some activities. And I thought it's useful probably just to go through some of these sort of things around, the context and the drivers for this, because one of the things which I'm very, very interested in is really the way in which technology might be sort of driving teaching and learning in a particular way. And unless we're very, very sort of conscious of that way and produce a very, very clear rationale as to why we're doing things, I think it's very, very easy to waste resources and to kind of jump onto the bandwagon. I mean, an example is the iPads. For example, giving iPads to students, it's very expensive. We did exactly the same thing last year to all our first-year science students. It cost us £100,000 to do so. So you've got to make sure that actually this is something which is going to be, actually very, really valuable in an environment where resources are very, very tight. I'd like to do a little bit around sort of curriculum design delivery, looking at some of the sort of pedagogies around distance learning. Again, it's that sort of understanding why you're doing something. So if you're producing a model for learning, what is it? What's that sort of what's the underpinning sort of theory behind that? And therefore, what tools should I be using to do that? And I think often there's that sense about being led sort of pedagogically or being led sort of technology. And I think that a lot of educators sort of pride themselves on saying, well, yes, no, I am, I want to be very focused on the pedagogy. I don't want technology to lead me. But sometimes, particularly when that technology starts to get sort of hardened, you're sort of stuck with only taking that particular approach to that. So technology tends to go out the window, and you've got no sort of chance to rescue that. Back. So I think it's looking at a kind of a very sort of complex picture of that. And I don't know whether people might have come across this sort of actor network sort of theory, which is looking at the way in which it's not technology and it's not the social. It's actually now sort of it's sort of culturally, socially determined with the technology. So it's a kind of quite an interesting kind of dance that we're doing now with those sorts of things. Looking a little bit about staff development, and then something about the business models as well. So that's the kind of aim that we're doing. I think just looking at some of the drivers, I think again sometimes you get the proselytizers of technology saying this is the best thing, apps and apps are the best thing that could have happened, to that, and they are they are very, very powerful. But however, how you might use them in education to do certain things is much more difficult to kind of, I think to predict, I suppose, and they're planned for. I know certainly for our iPads, we've used them very effectively in sports science in particular, because it means that everyone's got the same piece of kit that they can take photographs on, they can put videos into that, there's coaching apps, and so actually there's a whole sort of process by which you've done that. And there are people who are kind of leading that. On the other hand, there are also people saying, what's an iPad? I don't staff saying, what's an iPad? I've never used an iPad. How do I get trained on this stuff? And they're a bit like, this is a kind of slightly worrying sort of picture of horses going through a frozen river, and they've just been stuck in that river, frozen to death. And there's a sense that some staff are kind of like that, they're stuck in the river, just, I don't know what to do about this. And it's not the staff's fault at all. It's that sort of sense of how quickly we're moving forward. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Peter Hartley's work, who's a professor, he's retired now, but he was talking to me the other day about saying, well, 30 years ago, I had sort of 8 students, I had the overhead projector was the only thing that we used to do, and it was content, and that was what I was doing. I was teaching from the front with a minimum tool. Now what you've got is this kind of plethora of things, and no doubt it's kind of alienating a lot of people. Again, this is, people may have seen the Pearson report, particularly around MOOCs, about an avalanche is coming, and that sort of, again, it's sort of unsettled people, I think. Whatever you think about MOOCs, and I have my own quite strong views about that, there is that sense that we're being sort of washed over by, particularly by America, by this particular type of education, which is supposed to be the savior of everything, low-cost education for the kind of masses. Which is, Pearson, of course, are pushing this because they've got huge kind of interests in this. And again, it's taking that critical, perspective about what's the kind of external environment for this sort of stuff. So when we're talking about skills, for example, skills for using the tools, I think we're way beyond that as a kind of discussion now. People tend not to need those skills. They teach themselves the skills of things. Actually, what we really need are the much more critical perspectives around these things. So there are a whole bunch of other drivers, and if you shift, if you look at the shifts towards the sort of information age, that shift partially away from, facts, away from content, but what you do with that content. It's not what you know, but how you apply that content, and therefore, what's the environment where that content is being applied. So things like sort of critical thinking, problem solving, communication, all those things that make up. I don't know if you've got a graduate attributes project here or graduate capabilities project. But
it's something that we looked at as part of our learning and teaching strategy.
Yeah, okay. So that's sort of an international movement, I suppose, around graduate capabilities, graduate attributes. It's led by the OECD very much so. It was started in Australia about 10 years ago as a result of the Australian government saying, you're not producing the graduates that we want you to produce, and we're going to come and inspect what you're doing, your curricula. And the Australian universities all sort of got together and said, oh, we don't want any of this sort of government meddling. We'll produce a model of doing this. So they've come up with this notion about graduate attributes. And that's sort of taken hold. So for example, Scottish universities now all have to have a graduate attributes kind of initiative. And there's often these are the sort of the main sort of things which are embedded in there. But what it does mean, it allows the whole institution to build capability around those sorts of things to start to change the curriculum. Around that. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Oops. Okay. But how embedded that is when you talk to academics about, well, let's have a look at your assessment to see whether you're really embedding these things. So universities can try and shift that curriculum. Often what happens is that they're not embedded. And if you look at people's assessments, it's not clear that those things are really, really being assessed at all. It tends to be back to some of the content. And again, so there's a big sort of employability sort of aspects where it's driven, but it also allows you to be, to have some sort of unique selling position as well. So at Greenwich, for example, for our graduate attributes, we've got something about cross-culturalism and global awareness. We're 52% BME, for example. Creativity and enterprise. Our students don't come with really, really high UCAS tariff points, probably like your students as well. They've got to be creative and enterprising to get there in the first place. So there's some sort of sense about building, adding value to what you can do in an institution, and technology is part of that process. and then looking at the way in which learners are behaving slightly differently. I mean, we make a claim that learners are different. They're coming with different things. I mean, they're all coming with these things, for sure. And there's a lot of user-generated content going on, quite a lot of user-generated data going on as well now. So you can pick up, if I had asked Brian, I've got this app called Find Friends, so actually it's really useful. But if I had asked Brian to share details with me, his data would be telling me on his phone where he is, and I could then find him from that. Very useful for when my 16-year-old son phoned up at 2 o'clock in the morning about 3 months ago saying, "Can you come and pick me up?" I said, "Well, where the hell are you? I don't know where I am. Somewhere in deep South London." So using the app, I went straight to him. So it wasn't about content. It wasn't about him writing stuff about it. It was just his data was telling me certain things. And there's a sort of shift in the way in which we can develop some of these things. But also the way in which I think students are now starting to collaborate much more, and that sort of shift and that push towards providing an environment where we can enable those sorts of things to happen in order to get those attributes and capabilities. So let's stand on that. So looking now more towards the pedagogies of distance learning. This again sort of comes back to what I mentioned previously around, I want to be pedagogically led. I understand there's a pedagogy for or a learning design perhaps for supporting someone to learn something particular. And I'm not interested in the technology. There is an issue there, because often now, particularly now where technology is ubiquitous, we tend to use lots of tools and systems that are available, or in fact we're forced to use those tools. So actually, technology does make a difference to this. And if you're designing something, some sort of learning, well, if you've only got a pedagogy which is a classic sort of distance learning, you're providing postal materials, written materials, well, you're going to produce a pedagogy which is reliant upon that technology. On the other hand, if you've got access to technology which allows you that sort of dialogic position, allows you that, a lot more sort of peer-to-peer, your pedagogy is going to be quite different to that. So again, it's that interface between the pedagogy and the technology which is quite important. And Terry, intrigued by a recent paper by Terry Anderson and John Drom, who's talking about the sort of generations of distance learning in particular. So, they started with sort of postal correspondence into sort of, in what particular generation, probably 60s or so, 60s, 70s, started moving into that sort of generation of television. Remember my mum did her Open University degree when she retired from being a lab technician. And she used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to watch the Open University programs. I spoke to somebody from the OU quite recently. They said, "Well, we don't do that anymore." So there's a sense of things moving forward. Obviously now, a lot more sort of emphasis. I think the first workshop you did a lot around audio, video, those sorts of things. Now sort of moving into the sort of more immersive technologies, gaming, Second Life. Again, you've got sort of something coming up about simulations, I think. A lot more sort of web-based stuff. Again, so again, it's sort of the web-based stuff is, hello there, some chair here. Do you want to come around here? We find it easy. Yeah. It'll be about 20 minutes going around that. And so we're now sort of starting to think about what is the next generation of technology which might use to develop a pedagogy for distance learning. And some people are saying, well, it might be that sort of semantic web, these sort of intelligent systems. It's sort of very personalized systems, helping you to kind of to develop this sort of metacognition about the way you learn, and then being served up with particular resources around that. Okay, so just looking again at the way, an example of where sort of a technology has hardened the sort of pedagogy is something which we developed in Google, which we developed really for help supporting our course teams in terms of their curriculum development. And one of the things we were really aware of was that we've got a modular system here. So have you got a modular system as well? Okay. We were very aware that when we were working with course teams, they were very, very focused on their courses, you call them courses or modules? Modules, okay. So we call them courses, just to confuse things. So programs are composed of courses. So you've got programs composed of modules, I take it. And so you had people very, very sort of focused on what they were teaching on their module, and not really conscious. Even some of the program leaders were not really conscious of what the student experience was like of that. So we developed a Google tool for this, which is perfectly free. If anybody wants to use it, you're very welcome to. And this is just a test for it. And it plays out, it's just movie. So basically what you do is, you put in the data around the assessment of your course, okay? And then, so you put in information about the type of assessment it is, the weighting that it has, and when it's put on. It's just a simple sort of Google spreadsheet. And it plays out the student experience. So where you're suddenly looking at something like this happens sort of week 20 or so. Big, very big, high stakes assessments, lots of different types of assessment as well. You're saying, well, I'm designing my course using a pedagogy which is totally focused on the module, and I have to do that because that's the institutional way of doing things. And what we're not sort of necessarily working out is, well, what are the synergies between these courses? How do we take a broader view of these sorts of things? If I'm teaching, English here, and I'm teaching, say, presentational skills, I didn't realize presentational skills is also taught here as well. So there's a sort of lack of understanding really about in that particular sort of modular system about how do you develop pedagogy which is actually going to be very, very useful, relevant, valuable for the student rather than something which is usually over-assessed, overloaded. No wonder students don't come to your lectures 2 weeks before because they're busy preparing for 4 exams on the course, and the lecturers don't even know about it. They don't even know what the student experience is. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, moving on. So, so coming then back to some of the sort of theoretical positions, and again, I'm not a psychologist myself, but hello, Olive. Pleasure. Good to see you. Come around here, Olive. Yeah. So there are a number of I suppose, theories which are governing some of the pedagogical positions and approaches. And the one which was very, very familiar in the sort of late 20th century was sort of cognitive behaviorism. So sort of championed by people like Skinner, Gagné, I don't know if you remember some of those characters. So in terms of the sort of technology used, it tends to be sort of mass media, sort of print, very behavioral, sort of measurement around what you can sort of see being done. I mean, the cognitive bit came in to try and understand, motivation, attitudes, those sorts of things. But it was very much, okay, this is the kind of very highly structured, these are the outcomes, this is the way you're going to go through those outcomes, I'm going to test you on those outcomes, and I'm going to see whether you've got those outcomes. So it was a model really very, very much adopted by training organizations. It tended to be sort of very focused on reading and watching, very instructivist, very learner, tended to be relatively passive until they were told they had to do something. It was very individual, but did allow huge amounts of flexibility, of course, as well, which is so it's not suggesting there's, not providing any kind of value judgment over these things at all. I'm just saying these things kind of exist, and there is a sort of history and a legacy to some of these things. Tended to be very, very well worked out. I mean, as instructional designers, people working out what kind of a script and how they work through those sorts of things. Lots of sort of recall on that one. And the teacher was, again, that sort of sage on the stage type thing. But the advantage was very, very scalable. You could produce, like the Open University, thousands of students, with a small set of kind of resources. Okay, and then moving on, again, these are probably very, very familiar to you, but sort of constructivism, social constructivism, Vygotsky, Brunner, Piaget, those sort of people were championing this sort of stuff. Very much sort of focused on the notion about learning within a social context. The use of language was very, very important. The use of one's individual sort of mental schema were very, very important. So how do you build upon that? With sort of experts and with sort of scaffolding around that. And it was very sort of discursive, so very dialogic. Again, people working in lots of sort of groups around that, a lot of group work around that. But it also coincided, I think, with that notion about interactivity and the tools which enable that to happen as well. So we're sort of moving into a system, certainly around technology, where there was an environment where you could enable this to happen, whether you're inside the classroom or outside the classroom. So this was very, very much about us making meaning from conversations with other people, getting multiple perspectives around that, listening to people, working things out yourself, very much sort of about building upon your own knowledge around that, rather than just taking it, this is somebody else's knowledge and I've got to remember it, I've got to recall it, and I'm going to be assessed on that one. Sort of teacher guided, very much. So often a resource would, another resource is the teacher. Tends to be, again, much more discursive, essay-based, often guide on the side type thing. But the scalability was not as high because, of course, there's a much greater kind of investment in distance learning around the way in which you might do that. So smaller groups. And then what seems to be emerging now is this concept of connectivism. Which again, I don't know if people familiar with this term. Okay. So it sort of relies on learning as being a way in which you construct your learning through networks. So it's the networks, it's the resources, the contacts which are very, very important. And it relies upon things like sort of ubiquity of technology. So you've always got access to the technology. The champions of people like Stephen Downes and George Siemens seems to be very sort of Canadian led, this one. But it has given rise to sort of different styles and different approaches to e-learning. So the different types of MOOCs, for example, use this. And it's interesting when you hear what George Siemens says about this. He's sort of, his MOOC that he did about 2 years ago, sort of classic, the first sort of MOOC around connectivism, was about sort of rushing through sort of meadows and gathering sort of wildflowers as you went through, and getting lost in the process of that, and going in, meandering off into looking, oh, that's interesting over here, I'll go over there, and sort of so there was that sort of sense of people finding their own kind of pathways through this sort of jungle, I suppose. It is. I mean, it's interesting. If you look at the sort of some of the MOOCs, I would say that was pretty high, but there are some real kind of issues around the scalability of that. The other thing I think which has sort of started to become more mature are George Siemens' pronouncement about knowledge being held within objects as well. And it's, thinking, what on earth that is about. And then you sort of reflect on how you use these things. I mean, I got here on my bike from East Dulwich, and I didn't look at a map at all. I just relied on this thing from telling me, how to get here, really. So, in terms of the sort of knowledge which is embedded in these sorts of things, it's actually quite, interesting to think about. Well, how do you sort of, is that scalable? Is that a pedagogy? Can you use these, or how do we use these things rather than do we use these things? Because I think we all use them almost without thinking. Not necessarily a human being around the use of that. So there are these different sort of theories which are underpinning particularly distance learning, and probably there's that sort of interface with sort of online learning, whether that's in the classroom or outside the classroom as well. Don't have time. And then sort of looking at more sort of classical sort of e-learning theories, you've got sort of associative, constructivist, again, sort of picking up on these things, situative, connectivist, and some of the things which you might be doing. So when you're thinking about, well, what are my learners supposed to be doing here? Maybe this is quite a useful model of thinking. Well, they do have to learn this stuff, from scratch. The stuff they don't know about. They've just got to, almost learn it by heart, sort of rote learning. And I'm going to drill and practice on them until it sinks in. It's a with all the kind of conditioning that takes place around that. This again may be query-based learning, for example, authentic tasks, putting people together in groups, moving them into different sorts of environments. I mean, places like McMaster, again in Canada, went down that sort of problem-based learning as a whole institutional thing. And you go into the library, they've got sort of boxes of stuff, which is problem-based learning, number 32, tin. And the students are given, this is your problem this week. Go to the library, work with one another. It's those sorts of things which are around the pedagogy around that. And that's, of course, is scaled up institutionally. And then here, sort of situative, you've got sort of experiential, problem-based role play, those sorts of things. Okay, and then this is the kind of much more personalised. Again, it's sort of discursive, but again, sort of finding your own way through things. So again, it's another sort of model which might be quite useful for you. So some examples. I mean, this, skills-wise, BBC. If you go on the BBC, it's very, very sort of behaviourist. You've got a stimulation, a stimulus. You respond to that stimulus. You're tested on your response to that stimulus. You get a mark. You move on, sort of thing. Say with this is our CELT program, which I think Olive, you did, didn't you? Yeah, you did. Poor you. But there were a number of approaches. So each course took a slightly different approach. And I remember one of the courses was very sort of inquiry-based. So it was very much reliant on people working with one another and producing a kind of a multimedia aspect, and negotiating with the teacher, using a contract, those sorts of things. And this is the MOOC, which again I can talk a little bit more about, which we ran as a consortium with about 4 other institutions and the Open University. Did anyone do this or hear about this out of interest? No, okay. I can talk about that. Again, these resources are online. Started with about 2,000 people. Probably ended with, I would say, about 30. So you can imagine, that's pretty common for MOOCs. But the measures of success are kind of interesting, I think, around that. Okay. So the design principles moving into a MOOC, lots of different types of sort of MOOCs here. This one I think is quite interesting. This is, what does it stand for? Open Undergraduate Course Hybrid. And this is Coventry. There's a photographic course which has opened up its course, basically. I think not the whole thing, but probably part of it, to anyone outside to come in and do some work. So students within the university work with external people, and it's sort of opened up a very, very different type of learning space for people because they're working with people from the community. There's XMOOCs, which are much more instructivist, the sort of Coursera type, edX type MOOCs. Look at this video, engage with people if you can engage with people. Very focused on big data, really big data, and they've got thousands of people doing some of these MOOCs, so they can they recognize every keystroke which is made, every button which is pushed, and they can work out where people are going wrong. So there's some kind of interesting stuff going on, but again, huge attrition, very, very there's a diet. There's hardly any variety of instruction. I think it's the same old stuff going through. And I think also it's for people who are hugely disciplined in their learning. So most of the people there's quite a few people who've done analyses of these things now. It's mostly people who've gone through the degree process already, and they're updating their knowledge. So they're in a professional environment. Hey, there's some free courses here. I'll do that, and it's very useful. It's not the sort of there was South African colleagues who were hugely frustrated by Daphne. What's her name? Daphne. I can't remember. Collier, who ran Coursera, because if you look at her TED talk, she's talking about the way in which these MOOCs are going to save the world, and she used this photograph of students trying to get into, I think it's Johannesburg University, and some students died in the crush on that. And she's saying, well, this is going to be the savior of third world developing, learning, if you like. Get 12-year-olds who are learning this stuff, bright young things who are going to, be able to find those people, and they'll lead the world, sort of thing. And colleagues were really frustrated by a sense of this, this type of pedagogy coming over, into a developing world context, which was totally different, totally alien, really, to that sort of learning, and yet it's being pushed very, very strongly. So, then I've got some real sort of issues around that. The MOOC we did was much more sort of project-based. So it was around about people having a project and moving through that MOOC with that project with other people. Again, I'll sort of look at that a little bit more. it's still open, so if people want to have a look at it. But there are those sorts of design principles around, you know, the way in which you move through those things. One of the issues that we had was that we said, well, because it's a wild meadow, you basically use whatever you want to use. So if you use Twitter, use Twitter. If you use, we use CloudWorks as a means of developing a portfolio. If you use, you want to use email, you can use email. You use lots of social media, you can use it. And of course, after the first week, people just got totally lost in that, and he had huge attrition, and it was interesting looking at the kind of some of the evaluations about the sheer sense of frustration, as well as some people saying, actually I got a lot from this because I was able to make contacts with people. But it was very much, okay, here's some stuff that you can look at, but otherwise just find your way through that. So when you're thinking about the design of distance learning, that online has come some distance. Certainly, it's much cleverer, it's much more intelligent, some of those systems. But I think we have to be very, very careful about who we're directing this at and who our learners are. And if we're talking about undergraduate learners, well, there may be aspects of MOOCs which are very, very useful. There may be sort of elements where you can engage with the community in your MOOC, like the Ouch does. But actually, our learners need a lot of support, personal tutoring, contact, scaffolding, all those sorts of things. So, yeah, I don't know if this will play. There's probably no sound to this one, but I quite like this this video from Mean Streets. No, you can't hear it. Okay, it's a shame. It's basically this guy saying, "What's a MOOC?" 1973, this, and there's the barman saying, "What's a MOOC? What's a MOOC?" I don't know what a MOOC. You're calling me a MOOC? Anyway, gets whacked in the end. But there are some again some sort of quite interesting things. If you don't know the sort of the territory of MOOCs, they are free. I mean, things like registration just being lightweight, where you just go on, you click on a button, and you're in. And that's your course, and you just engage with the course wherever you are in the world, and you use your time flexibly. No doubt you've got some really big players. I mean, you've had millions and millions of pounds injected into MOOCs. So, Americans are going to make this sort of work. You've got places like FutureLearn, the Open Universities. It's interesting. When I went to, after I had this conversation with the Vice Chancellor at Greenwich, I contacted Coursera and I said, look, we're not, you're not in the world's 400 top universities or anything, but we do have pockets of real, excellence and interest. In the university, we'd be quite interested in maybe sort of working with you to develop something around that. I didn't get an answer at all to the email. Okay, so then I met Mike Sharples at a conference, and Mike Sharples is leading the sort of pedagogy for FutureLearn. And I said to Mike, Mike, I understand you're doing something different with FutureLearn to Coursera. And we're interested in, I understand the platform is going to be much more sort of pedagogically sound. It's not this kind of, so just because you start here, you go straight through without any kind of support. It's kind of much more enriched to it. And so Mike said, well, he said, yeah, that's the kind of intention, but you're not in the club. Greenwich is not in the club. We've got our partners in the club. And when I did a presentation on sort of MOOCs to heads of educational development, and what was interesting was that so many other universities had exactly the same experience. We're not in that sort of club, so where are we in that? And again, I think that that's something that we do need to sort of take note of. What is our kind of business model moving forward? It may not be this, but we need to keep an eye on that sort of territory because we're not in the club.
I think they've just opened up. They're called partners. On the website says interest in becoming a partner, which I hadn't seen before. So
I think that's much more about probably European partners because they're after European funding, I suspect. Yeah. But they have taken on some European partners very recently.
Yeah. We'll see if they reply to the email.
It's, yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Okay, so moving on then to kind of staff development. Where do you start with this stuff? We've probably seen lots of these kind of images of all these different tools. And again, I sort of go back to Peter Hartley's notion about, I started with an OHP 30 years ago. And he's somebody who really likes technology. And one of the things he was sort of reflecting on was, if I was to start again now with what I know, I would do all these sorts of things. And I'm thinking, hold on. You really don't want to do all these different things because you're just going to confuse people, the hell out of people. It's not that our students are not using many of these things. They're all using different things. And what I think, again, is important for us to do is to understand what it is that we want to do. You know, what are the affordances of some of these tools that we can use? You know, why would you want to use Twitter, for example, in your course? There's some really good reasons, but unless you know what those really good reasons are, you know, and you're very familiar with that tool, you know, you might want to introduce it into your sessions. Otherwise, you probably want to stay away from it. There's Thema. Yeah, it's the Thema project by Liz Masterman at Oxford, where she was looking at master's programs and the use of technology by teachers. I think came up with some really interesting findings in that students were using a whole range of different tools, but they were waiting for their teacher to tell them which tool to use for their learning. So they wouldn't use the tools in their learning unless the teachers were using them as well. And I think that's often the case for things like sort of Moodle or, you know, discussion areas. Well, if you're not going to use a discussion forum, you know, don't put it up there, because, you know, students won't use it, and they'll very, very quickly get a sense that you're not going to be, you know, you're not going to get engaged with them. So if you are using tools in your learning, I think what you probably need to do is to kind of really restrict it. Look at it from a program point of view as well. So in this program, we're going to use X, Y, and Z, not, you know, in this course, we're going to use this, in this course, we're going to use that, then we're going to use this one, then we can use that one, because I think, again, that's, you know, there's lack of consistency, there's lack of quality control around it, and you end up sort of confusing people. So there are some kind of issues, and it's sort of, you know, for staff, it's a bit like, how the hell do I put all this together? And again, I think, you know, I see it all the time where we do a lot of sort of staff development, sort of Yerkes-Dodson's law of arousal, where you know, you're getting sort of a sense of, you know, I can see you're starting to take a little bit of interest here, starting to arouse you here, you know, optimal performance. But actually, you know, you start to, as the university makes more and more demands on your time, students make more and more demands on your time, you start to move into, you know, some of the breakdown and burnout stuff. So again, it's something which I think the institution needs to look at very, very carefully around how do we move this forward and build capacity, not just leave it up in a kind of DIY model to staff, because you are going to get burnout if you're not careful, and you not only are you going to sort of, you know, be in this condition over here, I've lost that, you know, fatigue, exhaustion, but you might have the university bearing down on you saying, you're using Twitter, you know, what's the regulations around that, you know, how are you protecting your students around that? And how you protect yourself around those sorts of things. So, you know, you're then in a state of saying, oh, I'm so tired, you know, with this. I thought it was a good idea at the time when I tried it out. But so lots of sort of thinking through again, I think, around, be critical about use of some of these things. One of the things which that did work for me in terms of staff development, in terms of getting people to think, moving more, I suppose, from sort of behaviourists into kind of more social constructivism, was, and learning design, was that sort of sense around an activity leading some sort of learning process. And I found this model very, very useful. This is 2004, I think, Helen's model. And you could start sort of anywhere. So you could start with who your learners are. For if your learners are disaffected FE students, you know, well, you know, that's what you're going to start with. What have I got in front of me to work with? Therefore, that defines, you know, what the learning outcomes are, what the learning environments are, and what I might do with that. You can start with any of these things. So you might start with, you know, intended outcomes, and then base that around. What I think is quite interesting is that as it moved on, the model changed, and you then started to get these sorts of things happening. So you've got another, if I move that back again, so you've got, it's the same model, except you've just got other people here. So for me, it was about, well, that's interesting. You know, we've now got an environment where we can pull people in. There's a very successful journalism course at South Bank University, which is, it basically pulls in journalists, photojournalists from around the world on a kind of weekly basis. So, you know, they're talking to the editor in New York Times, and then they go to the editor of the Sydney Herald, those sorts of things. And they're pulling in to talk about their practice. And that's generated huge amounts of kind of interest for that master's group, because they feel they're getting, you know, this is really cutting edge stuff. I'm actually, you know, engaging with people there. So, you know, the technology will allow us to do certain things, and it allows us to design things in a particular way as well. And if Brian asked me for, you know, some links to particular types of help. This is, I found this, again, very, very useful. It's produced by Liz Masterman and Marion Manton at Oxford, called Phoebe, and it was a sort of a learning design tool. And you can't see it from here, but what's quite interesting is it says, well, what can I do with a particular tool? So if you say, well, I've heard about wikis, but I don't know what they can do with them. So if you click onto this, these are the things you do with wikis, or with blogs, or with PRS, voting systems, those sorts of things. Or, I've got these learning these outcomes here. So again, it's in one of these links up here. I've got to, my students are going to evaluate their learning in some particular way. What tool can I use for that? So it's linking up those outcomes with the tools. Again, I think that's very useful. OER Commons, so one of the things which I think we tend to do is invent everything. We spend a lot of time producing our own materials. The whole movement about open education resources is sort of gathering a pace worldwide. There's things like OER Commons where you just put in, you do a search term basically, and you come up with a whole set of resources that you can then plug into your learning environment. That then means you're working around those resources in a particular way and adapting those resources, but not necessarily creating those resources. And then more recently, Diana Laurillard at the Institute of Education, Knowledge Lab, has been putting together sort of pedagogical patterns. So is there a particular pedagogical pattern which might be useful? And there's some examples of that. So things like in science, the predict, observe, explain, that sort of model is quite a useful sort of pattern, and how you attach particular sort of tools and approaches to that. So coming to the end now. Activity theory was that sort of model about activity in the center, start with teacher outcomes, learner outcomes, environment. This I think is interesting. So you've got that sense about these mediating artifacts. So some of the tools, technologies we're using to mediate those artifacts. What I think is quite interesting at the moment is this stuff around here. So as we're moving forward, very rapidly into this sort of technological. Not sure how to. It's a minefield, I think. I mean, Eric Schmidt, who's the CEO of Google, just recently wrote a book, and even the CEO of Google is saying, we've unleashed this thing, we've designed it, but actually we don't know the hell we're letting ourselves in for. We don't know where it's going to kind of end up in. And I think for us, what's interesting is, well, what are the rules around using these things now? And institutions, I know at Greenwich, what we've now set up is a social media working party. We've got an OER working party, a lecture capture working party, because we realize actually we're just working in the dark here. We don't know. We've got tutors who are tutoring on Twitter, for example. Of course, when they look at what their students are doing, one member of staff came up and said, well, he's seen a tweet from a student saying, I want to go home and kill myself. Well, what does he do as a tutor with that sort of element of care, knowing that this person is going through something, and with no protection around, for the university, no policy around that. So these things are becoming more and more important, I think, for institutions. So, for me, it's we're now starting to become a little bit mature about how we use these things. It's not just a shot in the dark about using these tools. We now have to think very, very carefully about that. And hence, that's probably why the VLE is so attractive, because it's behind a firewall. You don't need to, what's on that VLE stays within that VLE, it stays within that community. But on the other hand, is it really the way in which students are learning? Are they using those tools, or could they use those tools outside the VLE, which are actually going to be probably going to work better? You can use crowdsourcing, you can work with your friends in a much more kind of effective way, those sorts of things. Okay, so just coming back now, a final slide is about the sort of business model, really, for University of East London, about what that is. And I think all institutions are trying to sort of battle with that. How do we sell ourselves to our students? And is there a kind of philosophy that we have around this, so that we can build capacity across the institution, so that people are doing things in a kind of similar way, similar approach, well defined, well thought through, with some sort of deep understanding rationales to that. So last night I went onto your website and typed in this up here, research, and I got all these lovely things happening about all the things you're doing in research. When I typed in teaching, what do you think I got? Yeah. Well, this says error 404. This website does not exist. And again, if you typed in learn, you're not the only ones, don't worry, we have exactly the same problem. And if you do it across almost any institution, I haven't come across an institution where you do /teaching, anything comes up at all. And it's sort of, I think it's an indictment about the fact that we, okay, you know, after Greenwich, we earn 80% of our income from teaching and learning. Okay, research is probably what makes us a university, but actually we don't have enough interest, I don't think, or enough commitment to teaching. And we haven't really worked out, well, what is it about teaching that we're doing in the institution? Yeah, I won't, oh, okay. I think I'll probably stop there, so I'm running over. So thank you for your attention. Okay.